Hello, and welcome back to the Masonic Roundtable, a weekly program where Masons from around the world get together to talk about Masonic news and opinions in a friendly and social manner. As a reminder, the thoughts and opinions expressed here are solely the opinions of the participants and do not represent any Grand Lodge statements or positions. Make sure you keep your conversations open for the public and on the level. As usual, to interact with us, we love chatting with you live. This one's a good one because we'll be taking your questions live on Facebook and on YouTube. So please make sure to hop in, say hi, and certainly ask some questions about tonight's topic. You know me, my name is John RUARK. I'm a past master of the Patriot Lodge, number 1957 in Fairfax, Virginia. And next up for his introduction, Joe Martinez. Hello and good evening, Joe. How are you tonight?
Hey, all you cool cats and kittens. This is Joe Martinez. We just started watching the Joe Exotic miniseries, so that's on my brain now. But yeah, Joe Martinez, current master of Manassas Lodge, number 182, Manassas, Virginia, member of 90 other things, and super jazzed for tonight.
Awesome, awesome. Next up, Jason Richards. How are you tonight?
I'm good. How are you, John?
Great. Thanks for asking.
No problem. I'm glad that you're doing well. I'm Jason Richards. I'm a past master of Acacia Lodge number 16 in Clifton, Virginia, and a member of lodges in DC and Ohio.
Excellent. And last but not least for tonight, our very esteemed and special guest. That would be the one, the only Brother Mark Tabbert, who is the Director of Collections at the George Washington National Masonic Memorial. So, hello and good evening, and thanks for coming on.
Yep. Thank you for having me. It's great to be here. Let me tell you a little bit more about myself.
Please.
So I'm a past master of Mystic Valley Lodge in Arlington, Massachusetts. I'm a member of Malta Lodge 318, which is my mother lodge in Burlington, Iowa. I'm a past master of Lodge of Nine Muses 1776 in DC, and I'm also a member of Quattro Coronati Lodge in London, as well as the usual stuff and a 33rd degree in the Northern Masonic jurisdiction. I've been a Mason for 22 years.
Nice. So that's like almost as old as our average listener. So that's super awesome. So it's great to have you on here. And before we get into tonight's topic, definitely want to give a shout out and thank all the patrons who've been supporting the show. You guys are awesome and help us keep this hosting costs way down so we can keep this up for many generations to come. Maybe 22 years later, right? When
2040.
Brother Tabbert comes back on in his 44th year, then we'll celebrate that.
Yeah.
So awesome. Tonight's topic is a good one. It's something we've been waiting for a long time, which is, I don't know, I mean, is everyone sitting down? Big revelation.
I am.
Okay. In case you haven't noticed, George Washington was a Freemason.
Yeah.
Shut up.
Good night, everybody.
No way.
The cat's out of the bag.
Yeah.
And not just any Freemason.
You speak your truth.
Fake news. What we're going to do is we're going to talk about the life and more importantly the Masonic life of Brother George Washington, and let's dispel some of these myths. Let's talk about what research that Brother Tabbert has found, and really just go anywhere the conversation goes. So this is your first reminder. If you're watching live, please jump in the chat. I know while I'll be talking, Jason and Joe are going to help moderate that and get those questions in here. And we will certainly be willing to talk about any questions you have about let's get to the ground truth. We have the expert here on anything you want to know about George Washington's Masonic career. So while we do that, I definitely want you, Mark, to talk about your research. And my first question for you is, this isn't your first George Washington book, right? So, did you find some parchment through the National Treasure movies that you didn't find before and dug up underneath the lost keys of Atlantis? Whatever it is, what's new in this book, and what was your focus in this brand new book that you wrote?
Well, so thank you for having me. I think it's also good to say my disclaimer too, which is I'm only representing myself. I don't represent any Masonic organization, and I really don't necessarily represent the George Washington Masonic Memorial Association either. So it's just me as an author speaking and a historian. So I did write about 6 or 7 years ago a little short, small book on George Washington's rules for life and civility, which was just taken the famous rules that Washington had written as a boy and put them into an order for different lodge situations directed towards Freemasons. And in the back of that was a chronology of all the Masonic events in Washington's life. So that's a $10 book that I produced really quickly that Steve McCall at McCoy's wanted. And it's a nice book, and it's just a good introduction with some basic resources in it. And that was something that I had that I could do easily. And it just occurred to me that you could take those rules of civility and divide them up for rules before lodge, during lodge, after lodge.
Mm-hmm.
Um, so that was just a small book that I did in a couple months. So in the meantime, I'd been working on this larger project that I started in 2014, was to really determine the whole history and everything there is to know about George Washington as Freemason. One of the things that, and it's in my book, I'll show you the copy here. We might as well get the plug out of the way. Here's the copy. I'll show you more about this as we go through it. But
And
the
what's it
book
called?
it's called A Deserving Brother, George Washington Freemasonry. It's published by the University of Virginia Press, which you can buy it through the University of Virginia Press, but you can also buy it through the Memorial Association, which of course supports the Memorial Association more than it supports the University of Virginia Press. And McCoy's in Richmond is doing the distribution. So if you go through McCoy's, they're just doing a wonderful job because they just have the shipping facilities and everything else to sell it through that. So that's the title of the book. The title comes from a letter that Washington himself wrote. Uh, he uses this phrase a couple times, but most famously to King David Lodge in Rhode Island. He goes up to Rhode Island in 1791 because Rhode Island joined the Union as the 13th state, and he's in Newport, Rhode Island, and he's given a letter by the King David's Lodge, which is primarily a Jewish lodge in Newport. His reply was, "I'm always happy to support the lodge, Freemasonry, and I hope to be considered a deserving brother," right? Which is an ironic thing, and it's important because
Right.
for Washington to hope that he's considered to be worthy of being called a Freemason is just shows his modesty and his understanding of the world
The
in a lot of
humility.
different ways.
Mm-hmm.
Yep.
So the book is really, I've always called this book the evidence book. And the real story behind that is that there's a presumption when I started working at the Memorial Association in 2006 that everything that was on Freemasonry was known. And there are several books written by people like William Moseley Brown, who was past Grand Master of Virginia, and others who we presume had gathered up everything there was to know, when in fact, once I started putting the pieces together, there was a lot of inconsistencies and a lot of confusion. And I'm not so much of a historian or a writer as I am a curator, and I'm more focused on databases and spreadsheets than I am on sentences and paragraphs. So it really bothered me that there wasn't a straight listing of chronology that articulated every single known incident. So that's where I started. The book starts with
Nice.
Microsoft Access database, just trying to plug in a chronology. Where was he in? Where was he then? What did he do? Why was he writing this letter? Why couldn't he go to this lodge? Whatever it was, so we could actually get a consistency. And believe it or not, for an institution that had been around 80 years, nobody at the Memorial Association had ever done that, and no Freemason. The closest there really was Paul Bessel, who was a past senior Grand Warden in the Grand Lodge of DC and has a very famous website. His listing, and he was a part-time librarian at the Memorial Association before I got there. So he was the one who got closest to that straight black and white chronology of this is just the facts. So starting with Paul Bessel's and these other resources, I slowly put together a giant database of everything. And then a lot of the letters and stuff are online through through the Library of Congress. So it was just combining a lot of different sources, trying to get it all together in one place.
Yeah,
And that's the purpose of the book, is to put
Yeah,
it all
and
together in one place.
that's interesting. That's one place I was going to start because I know that you can find on like Gutenberg and a couple other places like the public domain version of Washington's Masonic correspondences, And
Right.
that's to me, that's where I would start if I were trying to look at the, the at least the most public known assemblage of Masonic correspondence for George
Yeah.
Washington. But I can assume it's not complete, right?
No, so it's the foundation of my book, absolutely, and it's
Great.
an extraordinarily important book. The other book is a Sidney Hayden book, which is written in the 1860s. But that book, that Saxe's book, the Masonic correspondence, he doesn't articulate the exact locations of every letter. He includes letters that are not at the Library of Congress. And then, of course, he didn't find every single letter. He only was interested in letters that were to and from Masonic organizations and not to individuals. And there were individuals
Oh.
who wrote George Washington asking him for charity, asking for jobs, asking him to solve Masonic disputes, miscellaneous crud that just came his way because they thought he was so he didn't do everything. And Saxe admits in his book that he did publish everything, but he did that, he wrote that book in 1915. So, finding aids and such was a little more primitive back
Didn't
then.
the Google back then was pretty rough.
Right.
It's bad.
Hey, Mark.
Yeah. Yes, go ahead.
Quick question for you then. Is your book then primarily like a collection of those primary source materials? Okay.
Yes.
So it's kind
Yeah.
of like
So-
a compendium.
Yes. Right. So it really is.
The definitive
There's an
compendium.
introduction. So there's an introduction that explains, how I wrote the book and why. And then there's an introduction written by Dr. Edward Lingle, who was the editor of the Washington Papers for 20 years, and he writes a narrative that just puts it into context so people have a narrative. But what I wrote was just, here is when Washington got his entered apprentice. This is what's going on. This is the degree that he received. This is how we know what degree it was. These are the people who were at his degree. Then he got his fellowcraft. This was why he got his fellowcraft. And then he got, and then I write 10,000 words. Why wasn't he at lodge between 1756 and 1778? And I go through his diaries very, very carefully, explain what he was doing in those 20 years. And then here are the exchanges of letters, very specifically. During the War for Independence, when he comes home, it's very, very specific, which is, we know that Washington marched in this funeral for William Ramsey because it's in his diary. Who was William Ramsey? What was he doing? What was going on? How do I know William Ramsey was a Freemason? These sort of things. So it's very much, a detective. It's more like police reports: who, what, when, where, how.
Right.
And I wrote them as separate entries. I wrote thick ones and thin ones, and then I put them together in a book. So it really is the evidence book. And then at the end of the book is an articulation of how this mythology grew up after Washington's death, the history, what we'd call the historiography, various people writing books that lead to this mythology, including, the images of Washington presiding at a lodge meeting that you see at every Hattie Burnett painting in every lodge hall, even though Washington never presided at a lodge meeting. The very odd sort of stuff that grows up and why. And there are some very strong and important historical reasons and economic and social factors why Freemasonry developed this kind of mythology. It's not a horrible thing, but it's a confusing thing. And we're stuck with it, And
Well, Joe, that's your question, right?
Yeah. Well, yeah, kind of. It's no, but I think Brother Mark kind of hit it on the head, though. It's important to have that legend, especially as an American Freemason. That's definitely one of our go-to people when we walk into a lodge room and we see a portrait of George Washington.
Right.
So I totally understand the need for that. But we did have a bunch of questions showing up already on Facebook and on YouTube. The first one was, and I think everybody wants to know this: is it true that George Washington was irregularly made a Mason? Was he too young to have been initiated? What's the truth on that?
The short answer is it doesn't matter, because the lodge received a charter from the Grand Lodge of Scotland, and once you receive a charter, then all irregularities disappear. It doesn't matter, right?
You've been healed.
That's right, exactly. And that's not ha-ha funny. That's the way that the Masonic world works. Right.
Exactly.
So it's the same thing with Prince Hall and his brothers in Boston. It doesn't matter at all how Prince Hall received his degrees. Once the Grand Lodge of England gave those brothers a charter, that's it. There's no more discussion. because there's no power that's higher than a Grand Lodge. In fact, it's metaphysically impossible to have a power higher than the Grand Lodge. So the answer is, first of all, as a historian, anything that happens in Freemasonry in the United States really before 1820, it's wild, wild west. And to suggest, to try to impose the way things were organized after
absolutely.
1860
Right.
on anything before 1820 is
colonial
rude.
masonry was a mess. Exactly. It was a hot mess.
Right. And that's and
And
that's
what about-
the other book so yes, he was under the age of 21, but who cares? And no, they didn't have a charter when he was initiated, but who cares? It's not important at all. And they did get a charter later on, and the guy went to Scotland. He plunked down 10 pounds. They gave him a charter. The charter is back in Fredericksburg. It's been sitting there ever since. And the Grand Lodge, but what's more important, the lodge at Fredericksburg is now the fourth lodge in the Grand Lodge of Virginia. So the Grand Lodge of Virginia, when it was organized, it didn't have a problem with the lodge in Fredericksburg. So it's healed. It's a curious thing to talk about, but right, it's
well,
it just gets old after a while, right? It's go ahead. So
no, I was just going to say that. So the answer has been settled. So social media verse.
Yes, he was under 21. Yes, he did that. Yes, they didn't have a charter, but most importantly, the trump of all that is the Grand Lodge of Scotland gave him a charter, and it's discussion.
All right,
that's it.
Next
Thus
question.
ends the banality of Joe.
Yes. Well, it's not Joe. It's Facebook. So, next question, and I find this one rather interesting. Was there any correspondence that you read or that's part of the book where Brother Washington ran into brothers that were redcoats during the war that are documented?
No. So
No.
one of the things that's important to understand about this, Washington is not the protagonist of the story. Freemasonry is. After Washington, so Washington attends 3 lodges, his entered apprentice fellowcraft master mason, and then he attends a lodge, the next lodge meeting after that, after he's raised a master mason. And after that, he's not proactive towards Freemasonry for the rest of life. For the rest of life, Freemasonry comes towards him. He doesn't go towards Freemasonry. He's invited. He attends. He's his best friend's being raised. He attends. During the War for Independence, he goes to Regimental Lodge. He comes home from the war. He's invited by the Brothers of Alexandria. He attends. Right, but he's not going to lodges. Why? Because he's got other things to do. He's got a lot of other things to do. So he is not the protagonist in the story. Freemasonry comes to him, and it's how he responds. So he's has a couple occasions during his career, like when he comes back from the war and he's retired, and the brothers in Alexandria ask him to show up. He could have said, something I did a long time ago, I'm too busy. No, he writes a letter to the brothers saying, I am happy to support this. I'm just really, really busy because I've been away for 8 years. But when the time is right, I'll be happy to do whatever I can and support the lodge in Alexandria. So he had many opportunities to just blow it off and to say that was something I did as a kid. But he was actually very, very happy to be a patron of the fraternity for the rest of his life.
And you would say that says a lot more about the title of your book, right? Being a deserving brother, that the lack of attendance or his, participation does not reflect his respect for the fraternity and the living the values that are instilled in the fraternity. So
that's right.
Well, but let's not beat around the bush. I mean, we talked about this in the green room. You can have and I won't name names, but you can have a brother that goes to lodge every once a month for 25 years. It doesn't mean he's a just and upright person. It
22
just means
years.
he's really, really good at attendance. I'm not talking about Mark. No, but you have those brothers that, will give you a dirty look if you miss a meeting or don't show up, but yet they go and they go for decades and they contribute nothing to either their lodge or the world at large. Right. So, and I think, and I'm glad you brought that up, Mark, because I think that's a really important aspect of Freemasonry is just because you show up and you go to the meetings and you listen to the minutes being read, it doesn't make you a good Mason. There's all the other stuff and the lessons that are, that are inculcated within you that are supposed to teach you to be a better Mason, not the
Right.
attendance scenario. So,
Right.
fantastic point.
And so go ahead.
No. I'll let you
So,
finish your thought. There's
so
more questions.
just to put the fine point on that, which is, we could just use the a craftsman analogy on that. So, hey, I'm going to be a stonemason. I'm going to go down to the job site, sit on my ass all day, chew tobacco and spit in a can and watch other guys work. Does that make me a stonemason? It makes you a guy who's watching other stonemasons work. It doesn't
Makes you a
doesn't mean
supervisor.
anything.
That sounds like a man who sat on 66 traffic at any point in the last 10 years.
Right.
Management.
So it really, but the side of this is, and this is again a consequence of the 20th century, which is once you have the full corporation and the conglomerate that is Freemasonry by 1950, York Rite, Scottish Rite, Shrine, Eastern Star, blah 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 blah, and you have men who have 15-page Masonic resumes, and it's expected for a Grand Master to be involved with every organization. What do you mean he's not an Eastern Star? I don't know if he's qualified to be a Grand Master, or he did whatever. Then it becomes literally this resume building, and things shift away from who you are to what you've been doing. And then you just it becomes a very corporate thing, or you can even use a military analogy, which is, well, in order to become a battalion commander, I have to do my supply thing, I have to do my artillery thing, I have to do my logistics things, I have to do my S2 stuff, and then once I have all my ticket punched, then I can get promoted to lieutenant colonel. It's the same thing. It doesn't matter how well you did any of those jobs. So it's a product of the 20th century corporatization of Freemasonry. Whereas, an example in the book I'm trying to remember, I think his name is Peter Yates. Peter Yates, who was a very, very famous member of a very famous family around upstate New York, which is Giles Fonda Yates and Van Rensselaers. He was master of his lodge when he was like 25 years old, and he remained master of his lodge for 35 years. So that's a totally different kind of universe, right? Because he was a patron of his lodge, and he came from a wealthy family, and that's part of what he would do. So it's a completely different point of view. So anyway,
you're
I don't want to keep
absolutely
going on
that.
Washington could have paid his way through the fraternity as well.
Yeah.
I mean, he came from money, so
yeah. So that just segues to this point, which is, this, we might as well get this story too. Washington was never the Grand Master of Virginia, nor was he ever asked to be Grand Master. He was in consideration, and his name was suggested that he could be Grand Master. But when they were organizing the Grand Lodge of Virginia, they went through a couple different names. There's no evidence that they ever wrote to Washington asking him to be Grand Master, and there's no evidence that he ever wrote back saying, "Oh, I'm too busy and I was never a Grand Warden." If Washington had wanted to be the first Grand Master of the Grand Lodge of Virginia, the brothers would have figured out a way to make that happen. Right? So it's the same thing.
Yep. Absolutely. So speaking of, there's 3 different people asked the same question basically in different ways. So I'll just give you the easy version. But the question is, did Washington have a family history of Masonic membership? And if so or not, was it something that people of his means just did at the time? Did they join the craft if they were of a certain social status or what have you?
So when Washington joined, Fredericksburg was a frontier town, and the lodge, as far as our minutes goes, was only a few months old, the best we know. Washington's brother-in-law, his sister's husband, was a member of the lodge, and he had other cousins or other in-laws who were members of the lodge, and that's part of the reason why he joined. But but his half brothers and his father, there's no evidence that they would have been Freemasons. In 1752, and I had to do some shifting around here, so I don't have all my books handy, but I did publish, I self-published, but it's also going to be republished by McCoy's, The Almanac of American Freemasonry. And in 1752, when Washington became a Freemason, there were 15 lodges in the whole North America, right? Mm-hmm. So we're talking about maybe what, 300 or 400 Freemasons in all of the North American continent.
Mm-hmm.
So to have any kind of familiar connection at all, there is an idea that maybe Lawrence became a Freemason when he was living in England, when he went to school in England, but he went to school in North England. He went at like Northumberland, near the Scottish border, and there weren't any lodges in that area. So again, you know, it's like you have to, just because you're in England doesn't mean that there's a lodge nearby, right? You have to be near a lodge in order to join a lodge, and you have to hear of it. And that's part of what my book is about, is there, how did Washington learn about Freemasonry? Why would he know about it? And what kind of exposure would he had? So there's no evidence that anybody in his family were Freemason other than his in-laws. He had family in and around Fredericksburg that his sister married into. Yeah.
Nice. And another question, I think that's a doozy, and I'm going to love to hear your answer on, with basically being a traitor to the state. And I think they're referring to things like, like, in our obligations, and, our charges, depending on where you became a Mason.
Right.
They tell you things like being a quiet and peaceful citizen, respectful of the state, yada, yada, yada.
Yeah, so I would, it's in here, but in my book, page 43. So Anderson's Constitution's charge, and there's a similar charge in Dermont's for the ancients. I'll read it. A Mason is a peaceful subject to civil powers wherever he resides or works, and is never concerned with plots or conspiracies against the peace and welfare of the nation. If a brother should be a rebel against the state, he is not to be countenanced in his rebellion. However, he may be pitied as an unhappy man, and if convicted of no other crime, though the loyal brotherhood must and ought to disown his rebellion, they cannot expel him from the lodge, and his relationship to it remains indefensible. That is to say, that if you rebel against the state, you're not going to be expelled from Freemasonry. You'll just be pitied as a mess and a sad human being. But that doesn't disqualify you from being a Freemason or kick you out, right? So there's the reconcilement is, so Freemasonry doesn't have that level of loyalty. There are Grand Masters, but again, this is the Grand Master construct is something that's more of a 19th and a 20th century thing. Lodges were families, and they were very, very tight things that were units that happened to get a charter because they felt they needed to, or because they wanted to be able to communicate with other lodges and figure out a way when immigrants and migrants came through town that you could actually recognize them. But this idea that there was some sort of it was an international cosmopolitan organization, but it wasn't a corporation where there was a top and then there was middle management and then there was local franchises, like you work at McDonald's and you go, it's not that. It's not that at all. And people try to
argue
impose
like
upon that.
The provincial Grand Lodge system at the time could have been like that, but yeah, I mean,
came later, though.
It was still very loose. So it was pre George Washington.
So this idea that Freemasonry, I think men did whatever they wanted to do, and I don't think that there was a huge legal structure. The reason why you get thicker and thicker grand constitutions is because people figure out more and more bad ways to do things, right? And to weasel their way around things, and so they make more regulations. If they just made it short and sweet that said, if you do X, you're out. That's it. So it is curious, but as I've written in my book, in 1783, at the end of the war, you could have American Freemasons who were proud that Washington was a Freemason, but at the same time, George III's son, Frederick, was becoming Grand Master of the Grand Lodge of England. But of course, there was also the Grand Lodge of Ireland and Scotland and the ancients. So who is your loyalty to? So there's there's always divisions within the Grand Lodges. So,
Well, yeah, your answer was much more erudite than mine. My answer was always, well, once we became sovereign and once we became a United States, we really didn't give a crap what England thought. So,
right. Well, the question of separation from the Grand Lodges, the British Grand Lodges, was an interesting question, because that wasn't really something that was, the Grand Lodge of Virginia figured that out. early, but even after they declared their independence, they didn't meet for 3 or 4 years. So, and even the Grand Lodge of Massachusetts, they were independent too, the ancient Grand Lodge, but they had it wasn't until the 1780s when the Grand Lodge of Pennsylvania decided to really become independent that set all the other Grand Lodges in motion, or the other states in motion, to set up their own independent Grand Lodges. And we can talk about this further, but this idea of creating a general grand master of the United States, which was bandied about during the American Revolution, and it's in my book, and it blew my mind when I read it. Their idea was that they would create a general grand master, and they would pull the deputy grand masters, or the provincial grand masters, who were ancients
Right.
and recognized because of
Mm-hmm.
Pennsylvania were ancients.
Right.
And these these provincial grand masters in around the several colonies or independent states during the 1780s, 1770s during the war, would then come up with a list of names, such as maybe George Washington, to decide who could be the general grand master. And they would send that list to England for England's approval.
Wow.
Right? It wasn't like,
Ew.
we're going to get together and we're going to pick the biggest, bestest grandmaster in the hell with Europe. It was like, no, we're going to pick somebody and then ask for England to approve whoever we nominate to be general grandmaster. So they were still totally
like that.
dependent on some sort of ancient Grand Lodge of England
right.
approval to have a general. So
Now, one thing I
Yeah.
wanted to ask you, because I saw you get excited about this, this new fact that you found, and that was the basic question of what was the coolest thing or the most interesting thing that you did find
Oh.
in your research as you were putting this book together. What was something like, oh, that's really neat, or some new revelation, or something that you got really excited about?
Well, I think that was part of it, which is the minutes of American Union Lodge, which was a regimental lodge that's now American Union Lodge number 1 in Marietta, Ohio. Those minute books were transcribed in the 1850s, but nobody had really looked. They're published in the Grand Lodge of Connecticut's proceedings, which are online. You can read them, but it doesn't. Nobody's really published that. It again goes back to this thoroughness of it, which is. So other books on George Washington, like Saxe's book or like Hayden's book, or like they all said, well, Washington was proposed for General Grand Master, and they talk about that, but nobody shows the full presentation or the chronology of
Good.
what that meant. So if you actually read the minute books from American Union Lodge, which I've actually went out to Marietta and saw them, and there's one that's in the Grand Lodge in New York too. But so I've seen most of the original documents for everything. It says again, we like this idea of having a general grand master. We think it's a good idea. We're going to pass this idea over to the Grand Lodge of Pennsylvania, and this is the way they're going to set it up. Let's find all the other ancients who are in North America, see who they like to be their general grand master, and when we come to a consensus, and maybe it's George Washington, we'll send that name over to England and see if they approve. And if they approve, then we'll ask the guy, we'll elect him, we'll install him, and put him on a throne, and then he'll have the power to do 2 things, and only 2 things: to charter lodges into new territories until such time as those territories have enough constituent lodges to form a Grand Lodge, and then from time to time the General Grand Master can call a convention to get things together, and that's it. So I think that was, I'm sure there's other things, but that's just in my mind right now, is the idea that they actually thought this through, and it was an act of independence, but it was an act of total subordination to the ancient Grand Lodge of England. And all this was proposed during in a soldier's lodge filled with men who were open, violent disobedience against the British Crown, and their commander-in-chief is sitting in the room at the same time, right?
Wow.
So they're all still showing subordinates to a British authority for their Masonic allegiance,
Oh,
in
that's
the midst
interesting.
of all being open seditious, and would have been hung as traitors, potentially hung as traitors by the British Crown.
Just approved by charter first. Got it.
Right, exactly.
Wow.
So I think that's the most amazing thing, because
That is cool. That is really
because-
cool.
because part of what was going on here, and again, it's part of the fantasy, and I don't mean that in a negative way, but it's more of just a boosterism, the self-promotion propaganda, which was everything that you've read about George Washington Freemason as a Freemason, if you are a Freemason, is you get this airy-fairy wonderland story and you don't actually get down to the facts. And for some reason, people 80 years, 100 years ago decided that those facts were too complicated. They wanted to keep it simple. And instead of trusting people to hear the whole story. And the whole story is not, it's not, bad. It's not
No.
divisive. It's not anything other than more complicated than we actually kind of knew, right? Because guess what? People living before us had complicated lives too. you know,
Yeah.
they had to make hard decisions just like we do.
So, Brother Mark, 2 more questions talking about the here and now as opposed to the 18th century. They're both related. Number 1, do you have a couple of people asked this. Do you know of any date when they're planning to reopen the GW Masonic Memorial?
Yes, we're trying to desperately get tour guides, and we want to open it as soon as possible. We're aiming the 1st of April. We're looking for tour guides. Certainly, if there are young Masons or energetic Freemasons, please contact us if you can spare a couple days, because we're going to only open it as we have tour guides. So, Jason, if you're looking for something to do, we're probably going to try and open up on weekends, and then fill it up as we have tour guides. But there's a labor shortage, and there's other issues
I hereby
like that.
nominate
But
Jason Richards.
I second that
so
nomination.
that would be wonderful.
I don't want to get divorced. I feel like I would need to get divorced to spend any more time away from my wife and son.
Well,
and then,
how good a Freemason do you want to be? So we are anxious.
Nice.
Oh, that's on the nose.
The other half of the question is, what's the best way to support either you or the memorial by getting this book? Because it's available on Amazon. We talked about McCoy's. What's the best way to purchase?
So McCoy is just being a great Freemasons, and they're helping because they're doing the distribution. So they are, if you buy the book through McCoy is just doing the shipping and handling. They're not really making any money off of the book. But you could go to the website and buy other things from them because they're great guys down there, and they're trying to rebuild their business, of course, after the COVID universe. So any kind of support you can give McCoy's, that's a good thing. But 100% of the profits from buying it from McCoy's goes to the Memorial Association. If you buy it through Amazon or the University of Virginia Press, that money really goes to University of Virginia Press. So the way that this worked out is that the University of Virginia Press gets to work to sell the book to the profane world, to the non-Masonic world. So that's why it's on Amazon. That's why they'll promote it to libraries and colleges and university. And the Memorial Association, we promote our book into the fraternity. That's our side of the street, and the University of Virginia Press should stay away from that, right?
Perfect.
So
perfect.
So and I have autographed copies at McCoy's. If you want an autographed copy, you can get it through McCoy's. I think you just have to send an email. But since I only live a couple hours from there, I'll drive down there and autograph books. I think that's the easiest.
How about at the memorial?
Yeah. How about we just meet you at the memorial and you can sign our books?
Yeah, I was going to say that if you come to the memorial and I'm available, I will be happy to sign your book. Yeah,
we'll try to meet up when Jason's doing the tour guide, so we'll get the whole package.
Yeah. So again, there's no reason why we can't. I would encourage Brother Masons to start thinking about group tours. We're doing all that again, and do book signings or whatever you want. Or I do like to go to lodges, and I'd love to go anywhere I can to promote the book. But there is a speed bump on that because I don't want to go to every single lodge, because it's not worth my time, because I have other things to do. It's not that I don't like to, but so for me to come and give a talk at a lodge, the requirement is for the lodge or the Masonic organization to purchase, or to promise to purchase, 50 copies of the book and then cover my expenses. So that way you have a certain amount of money, people who will show up to get the book. It has an audience and a group that you can sell the book, and if the organization wants to mark up the book or whatever, they can make a little profit on. I don't care about that. I don't think anybody cares. I'm happy to do that and support the book and support the Memorial Association, of course, but I don't really want to go to every small town lodge in Iowa, and I can say that because I'm from Iowa.
Ha.
I don't want to go to Keokuk and Fort Madison and Ottumwa and Oskaloosa and Weaver and Burlington, and then go across the river to Macomb and Monmouth and Galesburg and Knoxville and all that other stuff. No. But if all the lodges in a district want to get together, that would be awesome, or Scottish Rite Valley or something like that. That would be wonderful. Yeah.
Sorry, Ohio, you're not getting Mark Tabbert this year.
Yeah.
Provided the Valley promises to get through their business quickly.
Yeah.
Also important.
Yeah. So what other questions do you have?
Let me see. Oh, yeah, there's a
So
few
Mark,
I'm not asking.
here's a question for you. What was, if you could pick one revelation or piece of insight that you've gotten out of this endeavor, I think what would be your favorite bit of insight that you've gleaned on George Washington?
Well, I think that the real point here is to shift the narrative, and this is sort of what we've been trying to do at the Memorial Association. So the Memorial Association and the Memorial was originally built by the founders to talk about the virtue and character of Washington. So if we think about Mount Vernon is a museum dedicated to Washington the man, his private life, the family who lived there, the enslaved people, that whole universe that Washington was in, his home. The Washington Monument in the District of Columbia is to Washington, the father of the country, the political figure, the statesman. The memorial is dedicated to Washington's virtue, and that we should be teaching Freemasons and Americans and everybody those virtues that are necessary to maintain a republic, and to be good citizens, and to be good moral human beings, and to maintain civilization for that matter. What happened in the 1930s and 40s and 50s is that the fraternity shifted away from, and American society in general shifted away from character and moved towards personality. And there's a whole lot of history about that, but it was no longer about who you were, it was about who you knew, right? It wasn't about the character of the man, it was about the connections you made and who you schmoozed and where you went to school and who you knew and blah, blah, blah. It was resume building. So everything in the 1950s just turns towards Freemasonry, George Washington, the Freemason, and just saying that over and over and over again. He was a Freemason, and then presenting him as the master of his lodge rather than a master mason. He was elevated above the craft, above the level, and put on this pedestal that he was a master, a worshipful master, rather than being a master mason, a man who had mastered himself before he tried to master others. Right.
Amazing thought.
So,
right?
so he, so
Great.
that became very stale and boring, and it becomes dead end. So what we've been working at the Memorial Association, the board of directors, from the board of directors on down for the last 15 years, is to try and shift that narrative back towards about being character and back about his virtues, and trying to teach people about the extraordinary human being that George Washington was. That once you get through, the simple facts about him being entered, pastored, and raised, and these sort of things, you get into his life and his character, and the extraordinary things that he did. That's more important. So the purpose of this book and what I was working towards is trying to figure out how to articulate that shift. And then through the process of this book, you see that as the fraternity is maturing and developing, as it goes through its colonial period, through its war for independence, and then into the federal period with a U.S. Constitution, Freemasonry is developing, and it's forming Grand Lodges, and they're writing Grand Constitutions, and they're sending these Grand Constitutions to Washington. Washington becomes a patron of the fraternity. He becomes this living example of what the fraternity is, and they're using him as a patron in the same way that in England and other places they use members of the royal family as patrons of their organizations, of their charities, of their trusts, and that's fine. What happens, though, after Washington's death, and more especially in the anti-Masonic period, Washington becomes the great defender, becomes the great stalwart, the great shield against the anti-Masons, and we revere him in many ways because he was our champion, because the men who survived the anti-Masonic period could hold on to Washington and could claim him as a member. That protected him from the worst kind of attacks that was leveled at Freemasonry as being part of the Illuminati, being anti-religious, being all sorts of horrible things that the anti-Masons said to him. In the same way that, if you know your history, during the Red Scare, or during the Joe McCarthy era and the witch hunts and these sort of stuff in the 1950s, there were plenty of communists running around. We know that. They infiltrated all sorts of places. But when Joe McCarthy went after, General Marshall, George Marshall, that's when he went too far. It was secession to George Marshall. Marshall was not a loyal American. That's when it kind of craps out. So it's sort of things that happened in the anti-Masonic period is once you have George Washington defending the fraternity, you can't really go too far, right? And that's part of the reason why we revere him, because they were during that time of crisis in the anti-Masonic period, the Freemasons who were holding on to George Washington, right?
Makes sense.
Right on. And I do see one more. I think we have time for one more question.
One more.
It's from Brother Chris. Brother Mark, can you speak to the aprons, gavels, tools, and other Washington relics? They've become proxies on Washington's Masonic legacy.
Sure.
So does your book have many gavels and aprons?
Yeah, so there aren't any gavels. Well, there's a gavel that he would used at the cornerstone ceremony of the U.S. Capitol that's owned by Potomac Lodge. There are, so I go through this in quite detail in the book, and I have images of the aprons that are in question. So I guess one of the things that's maybe shocking, but shouldn't be, because it's been kind of well known for 20 years or more. So the apron that's at the Grand Lodge of Pennsylvania that claims to be Washington's apron is not, so far as we can tell. There's no evidence that it was his apron. There are two aprons that are probably Washington's. One that's at Alexandria Washington Lodge 22, and the other one that's owned by Mount Nebo Lodge in West Virginia, in Shepherdstown, West Virginia.
One with
and
a
those
skull.
two have some. What's that?
The one with the skull.
Yeah. Yep. So both of them have strong provenance that can directly trace back to France, because they're French aprons. The apron that's the Grand Lodge of Pennsylvania has is not a French apron. There's nothing about it that's French. But we think it was made in China. A Dutch historian has figured this out. It might have been made in China as part of the first shipment of Chinese goods coming into the United States in the 1780s. In fact, the man who was in charge of that, it's in the book, he was a Continental Army officer. He was responsible for securing a lot of things for the Cincinnati from China. So it may have been an example of Chinese silk work that came to the United States, and maybe it was supposed to be given to George Washington, but he passed away before he could receive it. But the story about it being made by Madame Lafayette and this other stuff, that story doesn't show up until the 1860s. What's more, this stuff had been sorted out kind of in the 1990s, but it wasn't really much promoted. What's more, when Lafayette came to town in the 1820s, he came back to the United States and he went to Pennsylvania. If they had an apron that was made by his wife, they would have showed it to him when he was in town. And there's no mention of Lafayette seeing an apron made by his wife when he was in town in Philadelphia in 1824, 1825. So it's a wonderful story. It's a beautiful apron. There's a lot of great stuff behind it. But the two aprons that we can best document are the one that's in Alexander Washington Lodge 22 and Mount Nebo Lodge in West Virginia.
The one with the skull on it.
Yeah, the skull. So the skull, the skulls relate to the death of the master craftsman, right? There's a dagger on it. And those are known motifs used in continental Freemasonry. Yeah. And then the other items that would be related to the cornerstone ceremony of the U.S. Capitol, the trowel, the T-square, the right angle, the gavel. There's an image of them in the book. And then the last sort of big artifact that's not is obviously the lock of hair that's in the Grand Lodge of Massachusetts, in the gold urn that that Paul Revere made for it a couple years after it came in. And I have actually, of course, had the opportunity to hold that a couple times. Here's an image of it.
So did I. We saw
So
it too.
cool. Yeah, hold that up
As
again.
a Massachusetts, I'm sorry. As a Massachusetts Freemason, I've had an opportunity to.
We are too.
Yeah. So.
Yeah, that's a weird relic, just for what it is. A gold urn, right? That was constructed by Paul Revere and
Yeah.
has a lock of George Washington's hair in it. And I mean, if you get enough DNA off of that, you can rebuild some founding fathers. It's awesome.
Yeah. I think there's a Star Trek episode about that. So the other side of this, of course, there's a couple things, which is the letter. So this is important too. So the Grand Lodge of Massachusetts wrote a letter right after they found out he died, and Martha Washington, the secretary, Tobias Lear, wrote the letter back saying, "We're happy to do this. She wants you to have this lock of hair." So again, if there was any animosity that the widow had towards Freemasonry, she didn't have a problem with that. And so the letter is reprinted in the book, so you can read the letter, the exchange between the Grand Lodge of Massachusetts and Martha Washington. The thing about that gold urn is that, of course, gold was extraordinarily rare in North America before the 1848 gold rush in California. So to make anything out of gold in the United States was an extremely expensive proposition. The other thing too, which is curious, is that President Garfield, when he was assassinated, the Grand Lodge of Massachusetts made a companion urn for Garfield as well. There's another gold urn that the Grand Lodge of Massachusetts has for Garfield. Yeah.
I know that.
I'm not sure if it has a lock of hair, but so
See,
it's an extraordinary piece because this goes back to the goofiness of how wild west Freemasonry is. So literally, in the Grand Lodge of Massachusetts, when the new Grand Master is installed, he is handed that urn and he's told to possess it. And then, of course, they take it back and they put it in the vault. But for the first 100 years or so, oh no. It was given to the Grand Master and he held on to it in his private possession. And then he turned it over to the next Grand Master. And I think that happened from 1800 to maybe even 1900 before they decided maybe that was a bad idea. So it was literally a relic that was literally passed on from Grand Master to Grand Master for 60 or 70 years. I haven't really detailed that out completely, but it's pretty clear that that's what was the idea behind it. Right. So again, then somebody decided, well, maybe, we don't want to do that. So that's an extraordinary thing too, but there's not many. The rest of the material is mostly the books and the letters that were sent him. And Washington received a lot of sermons too. He received 10 or 12 different sermons that were either just sent to him by pastors who had preached at a Masonic event at a St. John's Day, or Joseph Webb, who was Grand Master of the Ancient Grand Lodge of Massachusetts, sent him several sermons with his signature on the top, Joseph Webb signature, that were just of other sermons related to St. John's Day that pastors had preached on. So Washington had read a fair amount of those sermons that were preached by at different places. So
awesome. Well, this is really great. The past hour's flown by, and so normally what we do is we ask a final question about the topic to draw on each of the hosts' individual experiences. But seeing as that you are the residential expert on George Washington, I have just one simple final question for you before we wrap up tonight's show. And that question for you is, now, you've emphasized multiple times throughout this episode that it is not so much about George Washington, but it is more about the fraternity and his virtue and his values. And that's certainly everything that you said you're trying to commemorate in the Masonic Memorial. And so let's fast forward. Let's just say through the powers of the DeLorean that George Washington were to be fast forwarded to today. Understanding, yes, he was a product of his times, and a lot of the revolution shaped his life experiences. But how active do you think he would be in Freemasonry today? And what would be his leanings? What would be his focus as far as being involved with the fraternity?
Well, so I think it's safe to say that Washington was an introvert. He was not a happy-go-lucky guy. He had a very few close friends that he hung out with. He wasn't a type of guy who would schmooze at parties. He felt uncomfortable in crowds. Um, he was socially awkward in some ways, but he had a commanding presence and he was quite charismatic. I think that he would be, if he was in Freemasonry, he would find a small lodge to be comfortable in. I don't think he's the type of guy who would be in three or four lodges. I don't think he would be, doing Scottish Rite, York Rite, and the whole thing. I
I
think
was
he
going to
would be
ask
in a
the
very
appendant body question, which
right,
would be his appendant body, but yeah, you kind of hit the nail on the
right.
head
So,
there.
so I think that Washington. That's why that's why his relationship with Alexandria Lodge is important, and obviously Fredericksburg, because he remained member of both lodges. But the painting here, the painting was a gift to him by him to the lodge. So the lodge wanted a painting of him, and the guy who did it, William Williams, wanted to do it. Washington didn't like portraits, but he sat for that portrait as a gift to his friends and neighbors in Alexandria.
Wow.
So Washington attended lodge when he was um, when he was a colonel in the Virginia Regiment, to be at his best friend's raising as a Master Mason. So this is part of the other relevation as we think of George Washington. And we think of Freemasonry as schmoozing around on different levels and going to different things because we have automobiles and we have internets and we can
Right.
do all this stuff.
Hmm.
And we kind of think that George Washington traveled a lodge, and why wasn't he been able to do that? He had the wherewithal. When in fact, Freemasonry then, and should be today, should be an intimate band of brothers tied in your little lodge, doing your own little thing, encourage each other to be better husbands and fathers and sons, and in your workplace, rather than there's nothing wrong with that networking and being hyper
No.
extroverted, but that's not really what Freemasonry's purpose is. Freemasonry's purpose is to be very, very small organization with people who live down the street and around your. Remember, in the old days, the Tyler went to Tyler when it was time for a lodge meeting. The Tyler went around town and handed out, the lodge notices. They weren't mailed out. He knew where you lived. You lived in a small town. He ran around the town and handed out you the notice. I've heard people thinking about doing that again, and I kind of like that idea, and that's how intimate the organization was. They didn't put things in the mail. They just came by and said, we'll be meeting by order of the worshipful master,
Right.
next Thursday, you will show up. Oh,
All right.
right.
All right. Well,
Yeah.
that's excellent. Thank you for giving us that context. And again, that's the beauty of the research that you've done. The historian aspect, that you can take the character and personality and try to see how he would react, and that's exactly the answer I was looking for.
Good.
Because
I aim to please.
it certainly tells a lot about his personality, and you've done the great research in pulling all this
Thank you.
together. So one last plug for that. I know that
Yep.
you said that McCoy's would be the best way to get in touch with that. That would
Yep.
give the most benefit to the memorial as well as
Yeah.
to the Virginia Press.
And if the other thing too would just be nice, as I noticed on this, if you want to write a review, if you want to put something on Amazon, I'm happy to see your questions or respond to that sort of stuff. I'm just curious to see how people like the book too. So that just makes me interested.
Excellent.
We all want to be liked, right? So
Even George
I don't.
Washington. Well, good, Joe. We got you way covered about that one.
Oh, good. Thank you.
All right. Well, Brother Mark, thank you very, very much for coming
Thank
on,
you.
share your experience and your research. And I guess I wish you the best in getting this book out there, getting the the personality and characteristics and virtues of Brother Washington out there for the next generation. So thank you again for all your hard work.
Thank you.
All right.
Yeah, thank you, brother.
My pleasure.
And for
Great
that,
evening.
yeah, I want to thank you all very much for watching, and keep searching for more light. Have a good night.